he treats the narrator like she's a bit of an idiot. At one point they're talking and he's just like, stop biting your nails, they're ugly enough already. And I was like, rude. There wasn't really a character that I felt that I could root for. To be honest, I didn't really like any of them. They're all very smart. I just feel like anything could happen in this book and I'd be like, sure, I believe that. Hello, welcome to this video. My name is Rhianna and today I'm going to talk a bit about some classic books that I've recently read. So first I want to talk a bit about my history with classic books, what classic books I've read in the past. So when I was at school, I studied the mandatory English literature GCSE, and we studied, I think, some texts that are very common for literature students in the UK to study, one of which was In Spectacles by J.B. Priestley, which I was always a big fan of. And the play is about how your actions can really influence events, even if those actions are small. And the whole idea of the play, I think, is just about being more empathetic. Because even if you say one rude thing to someone, that may act as a catalyst for their whole life falling apart. And I remember in one of the essays I wrote about that play, I wrote about how the curtain coming down at the end was like a guillotine coming down on all the characters. And I was like, look at me, analysing a play. And then I studied A-level English literature and we studied 3 texts. We studied Macbeth by William Shakespeare, The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter, and Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. And I did really enjoy all 3 of these pieces of writing. I think Macbeth is still my favourite Shakespeare play. But in the exam at the end of the year, we weren't allowed the texts in the exam, and any question could come up. So you really had to memorise so much of these texts to be able to directly quote them in the exam. And I think as a result, I felt like I became a little bit too familiar with the stories. And then I studied English and creative writing at university, and I studied many classics throughout that degree. And then once I graduated, I found that I wasn't reading as many classics. I think maybe because I'd had so much required reading for many years, I really just read what I wanted to read, and at that particular time in my life it wasn't classic literature. And I think that's because when I was younger, I sometimes didn't find classic literature that accessible because of the often higher register, the often use of a wider vocabulary. So I found it a bit more challenging to get through the pages and to really fall into the story. But I think now that I'm a bit older, I don't find it as challenging, probably because my vocabulary's widened and I have more life experience. And also I think I'm not as intimidated by classics. I go in with them with a bit more of an open mind. Not like, if I don't understand. I'll try my best. But I think I felt a lot of pressure when I was in my teens studying literature to really gain a lot of insights from these books and create a lot of unique ideas. And I think that sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes you read classic, you're like, I'm not getting anything out of this, and that's a perfectly viable reaction. Anyway, I'm waffling. Let's get on with the classic books that I've read recently. Okay, so this classic book has become one of my new favourite books of all time, which I thought it would become prior to reading it, because it ticks a lot of the boxes of things I like in stories. So I love Gothic literature. Gothic literature is probably my favourite form of book to read. I love a Gothic eerie setting with mist and autumn vibes. I also love a book that is set in one setting, so you get to really know that setting well, and I find that when I enter the story it's so easy to envision everything because I get so familiar with the setting. I also love a good mystery, and I didn't know anything that was going to happen in this book before I read it, which I think made the experience even better because I was so shocked at the twists and turns that occurred. And that book is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. So this book was written in the 1930s, and it's about this woman, an unnamed narrator, and she is in her early 20s, and we find her in Monaco, and she is acting as a companion to this older woman who is not very nice, to be honest. She's a bit of a Karen, one would say. And the narrator meets Max de Winter, and he is an older man in his 40s, and he's a bit mysterious and also very wealthy, and it is known among the socialites of this era that his wife died a few years earlier, and it seems like he's quite depressed because of that fact. And the unnamed narrator ends up falling in love with him. Max de Winter ends up falling in love with her, or arguably he didn't fall in love with her at all, he just wanted to marry her because why not? And then the unnamed narrator goes to Manderley which is this beautiful estate in, I believe it's in Devon somewhere. I presume it's not a real place, but she goes to this estate and she starts to find out more about Rebecca, Max de Winter's dead wife, and she starts to become a bit obsessed with her and filled with envy, and there's a mystery about what really happened to Rebecca and how she died, and that's the story. And I think one of the highlights for this book for me, as well as what I mentioned earlier about how it hits a lot of things I like in books, was the unnamed narrator. She is fantastic because she is filled with a lot of insecurity and naivety, and she often doesn't really understand herself, and I think it reminded me a lot of how I was in my early 20s. And Max de Winter isn't really a nice guy. When he proposes to the narrator, he says, "I'm asking you to marry me, my little fool." And he doesn't say this in jest. I feel like he says this completely genuinely. I think throughout a lot of the book, he treats the narrator like she's a bit of an idiot. At one point they're talking and he's just like, "Stop biting your nails, they're ugly enough already." And I was like, rude. And Max de Winter also says numerous times that he doesn't want the narrator to grow up. He wants her to stay naive and young forever, and that's, you know, a big red flag. And I think the narrator, she feels compelled to not criticise Max in any way, which I think is a result of the time in which she lives. I think in the 1930s it was very much expected for wives to support their husbands. And there was a part I really liked in the book when Max de Winter goes away for the weekend and the narrator feels so much lighter. She's like, "Why do I feel so much happier here on my own?" And it's of course because her husband is away and he's bringing her down, but she can't really admit this to herself because I think she so desperately wants to love him, even though he's not really a nice guy. And I suppose this book could be argued to be a bit slow because a lot of the book is the narrator wandering around Manderley and wondering about Rebecca, but I think there's so much tension within these moments because as the reader you're really wondering about Rebecca too, and you're wondering where the story is leading, and it does lead to a big crescendo at the end. The last 100 pages are so enjoyable, there's so much drama within them, and yeah, what a great book, love it. Next I read Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, and the writing in this book might be like the best writing I've ever read. There are so many lines in here which you can quote. There's so many discussions about what it is to be a person, about America, about women, about art and whether it's useful or useless, and it's really philosophical in many ways. And I really love that aspect of the book. I wrote down a few quotes to share. So one of the quotes I love is, "Nowadays people know the price of everything and the value of nothing," which could be applied to nowadays as well. I also liked, "If the cavemen had known how to laugh, history would have been very different. And there are many things we would throw away. If we weren't worried, other people would pick them up." Also, a lot of these characters are rich Englishmen, so they kind of don't really like America very much. They commented on how America wasn't discovered but detected. Also, one of them says, "Where do bad Americans go when they die? They go to America, of course." Also, because this book was written in the late 1800s and the characters are all rich Englishmen, their perceptions of women aren't particularly favourable. So they say, "Women inspire us to create masterpieces, then prevent us from completing them." Henry also says, "Women are a decorative sex. They never have anything to say, but say it charmingly. There are 5 women in London worth talking to." And I believe Oscar Wilde was an advocate for women's rights, so I don't believe he's writing these quotes as if he believes them. I think he's writing them because Henry, his character, probably wouldn't have viewed women that favourably just because of who he was and the time that he was brought up in. I've spoken a lot about the brilliant quotes and writing in this book, but what is this book actually about? It's about Dorian Gray, and a painter called Basil draws him, paints him, makes a picture. And Dorian Gray is incredibly handsome, like so handsome you can't believe it. However, despite Dorian's good looks, he maybe isn't the nicest guy. And so it's about how you can be beautiful on the outside, but maybe on the inside you're not so nice. It's also about human vanity and the capacity humans have for malevolence. It's also about a number of other things. There's so many ideas in this book, and it's so short as well. It's quite amazing how many things are packed within this tiny little novel. And this definitely is one of the best books ever read. If I had to say one thing I didn't like about it, it's probably that there wasn't really a character that I felt that I could root for. To be honest, I didn't really like any of them. They're all very smart and have a lot of interesting and insightful things to say, but I didn't really connect with any of them. Okay, the next book I want to talk about is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel García Márquez. So I'm actually just over halfway through this book, but I wanted to film this video today and I also really wanted to speak about this book because, wow, this book is crazy. So I made a short about this book a few days ago and I spoke about how much I liked the opening line, and the opening line is, "Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice." And I mentioned in that video how that moment in the book is actually so minor. The moment Aureliano faces the firing squad and the moment he discovers ice are such small moments in this book because so much happens. It's about a town called Macondo and the family and the people that live there, and that family, we follow them throughout multiple generations. So the first generation is Jose Arcadio Buendia, and he marries a woman named Ursula, and initially we hear about their meeting and their love story, and then they have 3 children. They have Amaranta, Jose Arcadio and Colonel Aureliano Buendia, and they also have an adoptive daughter named Rebecca. And so it's fairly easy to understand because you're following that family, but then that family then expands. Colonel Aureliano, he marries, he has children. Jose Arcadio, he marries, he has children. Amaranta doesn't, so but she also has her own stuff going on. And thankfully there is a family tree at the beginning of this book, which I think I desperately needed when reading, because I think I would just get completely lost if I didn't have it. I say that a majority of books can be read as audiobooks. I think this is an exception. I think this would be impossible to understand as an audiobook, to be honest. There's also like some magical realism going on in this book. So this is something that happens in the beginning. We have Jose Arcadio, the head of the family, and he ends up going a bit mad and ends up sitting at the base of a chestnut tree, and he stays there for years. And of course that wouldn't necessarily happen in real life, so you have to suspend your disbelief, and that's just one of many kind of odd things that happen in this book. And I think this book reminded me of the style of Wes Anderson a bit. So something like the Grand Budapest Hotel, it's sort of a bit heightened, so you as you're watching it, you kind of believe anything could happen because of the way everything's formed and everything's created. And the same thing is true for this. I just feel like anything could happen in this book and I'd be like, sure, I believe that. And also about this book, every chapter is around 20 pages long, and I don't think it's a book that you can really read quickly because a lot happens, and so I think you might just get like swamped by the story and not be able to find your way to the surface again. And so I've been reading 1 chapter a day, 1 chapter every other day, and that works quite well because each chapter is around 20 pages, and I think that's a great way to read it. Also, there is a line in this book which I think is one of my favourite lines that I've ever read ever because of its use of imagery and description. To give you some context, Aureliano Buendia is going to see his sister Rebecca. Rebecca is not in a good way. The writer could have just said Rebecca wasn't looking her best, but instead the writer wrote this: "He had the impression that the phosphorescence of her bones was showing through her skin, and that she moved in the atmosphere of St. Elmo's fire, in a stagnant air where one could still note a hidden smell of gunpowder." Amazing. Okay, so those are some classic books that I've recently read. Please let me know what you think about any of these books, or do you have any classic books that you think I should read? Thank you very much for watching this video. I very much appreciate it, and I will see you in another video soon. Bye bye.